Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into something that honestly sounds like it was ripped straight out of a sci-fi movie, but it's actually happening right now in medical science. We are looking at the absolutely incredible concept of moving from simply pausing biological death to actively reversing it. We're talking about rejuvenating organs entirely outside the human body. Okay, let's jump right in. For decades, the entire field of organ transplantation has been totally obsessed with just one thing, and that's preservation. Just keeping an organ barely alive long enough to rush it from the donor to the recipient. But the ARC system we're looking at today completely redefines that. We're talking about a massive shift from mere preservation to active, therapeutic rejuvenation. And to really grasp why this is such a monumental leap, we kind of have to look at the pretty massive flaws in how we do things right now. So, let's hit Section 1, the organ preservation problem. I want you to think for a second about how we transport some of the most precious, life-saving cargo on the planet. Get this, we literally transport life-saving human organs in the exact same cold, static ice coolers that you might use to pack some beers for a picnic. Seriously, it is an incredibly primitive method, and it creates a massive biological risk. See, when you just throw a kidney into cold static storage, you're subjecting it to what's called the ischemia gradient. You aren't truly stopping cellular damage, you're just slowing it down. As the prolonged hypoxia, which is basically just a lack of oxygen, sets in, we see three really devastating outcomes. First, primary non-function, where the organ just totally fails to wake up. Second, delayed graft function, where the patient needs heavy dialysis after the transplant. And third, irreversible tissue necrosis, which is literal cellular death. So clearly, we need a paradigm shift, right? We're moving from that dormant, ice-cold past to the active, functioning present of normothermic machine perfusion, or NMP. Instead of chilling the organ down to 2 to 4 degrees Celsius, we maintain a warm, physiological 37 to 38 degrees. We introduce a closed-loop pulsatile circulation. So we aren't merely pausing death anymore. We're actively sustaining biological life outside the body, minimizing that reperfusion injury in real time. All right, moving on to Section 2, inside the bionic circuit. Let's speed things up a bit and take a rapid-fire tour of the incredible hardware that makes this happen. What's truly fascinating here is how the mechanical hardware maps directly onto biological metaphors. Right at the center, you have the organ suspended in the tissue chamber. Over to the right is the artificial lung, an oxygenator supplying 95% oxygen and 5% CO2 at 1.5 milliliters per minute to keep saturation locked at a perfect 70%. Below that is the artificial heart. This is a pump providing pulsatile flow to maintain a stable mean arterial pressure of roughly 70 millimeters of mercury. And over on the left, you've got the artificial kidney, a hollow fiber dialyzer pulling out the small toxic molecules while keeping all those essential large proteins safely inside this pressurized 800 milliliter loop. But, of course, an engine is absolutely nothing without fuel. The highly complex ex vivo biochemistry relies on a base carrier of packed red blood cells and normal saline. Then, a continuous nutrition module provides 10% amino acids, vitamins, and 5% glucose. And all of this is meticulously pushed through a syringe pump at a desperately slow 24 milliliters per hour. On top of that, we're continuously dripping in vasodilators to keep the vessels nice and elastic, alongside really precise doses of heparin and dexamethasone to stop any clotting and inflammation. Now, you can't just set this whole thing up and walk away. The system requires intense, continuous telemetry. We're tracking arterial pressure, arterial flow using Doppler ultrasound, and urine output. The sampling protocol demands a check every single hour for the first 6 hours just to ensure the pH stays locked at 7.3 and oxygen saturation holds at a steady 98%. It's an absolute, perfectly monitored homeostasis. Which brings us to Section 3, the 64-hour limit. Because as incredible as this bionic circuit is, there's a heavy reality we have to face. It's time to introduce the main antagonist of our explainer, the renal resistance index, or RI. You calculate this by taking the peak systolic velocity, subtracting the end diastolic velocity, and dividing it by the peak systolic. Clinically speaking, this spiking wave is the ultimate proxy for microvascular injury. As tissue damage slowly builds up over time, the internal resistance to blood flow spikes, and that signals an impending systemic failure of the organ. So we have to ask the crucial question. We've built this perfect machine, we've fueled it with the perfect biochemistry, but how long can this ex vivo life actually be sustained before that internal resistance just becomes too much?
Let's look at the hard data. This 72-hour timeline tells a really dramatic story. Phase 1 is stabilization. You can see lactate levels drop beautifully, and arterial pressure locks in at 70. You also see this red sawtooth pattern, where hemoglobin is repeatedly topped up because red blood cells inevitably break down. But right around the 50-hour mark, something shifts. Sodium plummets, and urine production completely stops. The organ is officially beginning to shut down.
And here is the undeniable fatal crash, exactly at the 64-hour threshold. Despite all our active normothermic perfusion, that renal resistance index violently spikes upwards. At the exact same time, the arterial flow, which had been humming along nicely at 85 milliliters per minute, plummets to absolute zero. Unchecked necrosis and a cascade of cellular death dictate an absolute hard limit of 64 hours for this iteration of the machine.
So let's look at section 4, the strategic pivot. Science has given us a hard boundary.
Since we literally cannot keep the organ alive on a machine forever, we have to completely change the rules of the game. The original assumption was, how long can we keep a healthy organ alive during transport? But that just creates a limited logistical market. The new strategic reality is vastly different. How much can we actually heal an impaired organ during a 64-hour window? We have to stop viewing the machine as a glorified transport box and start treating it as a temporary, fully monitored operating theater for active therapeutic rejuvenation. And why does this pivot matter so much? Because the pool of ideal, perfect donor organs is shrinking, while extended criteria organs, meaning older, pre-aged, and functionally compromised ones, are on the rise. Meanwhile, patients with end-stage renal disease face a grim 40 to 50% 5-year survival rate. That's the clinical equivalent of advanced stage 3 colon cancer. These patients simply cannot afford to sit around waiting for a perfect organ. We have a clinical mandate to learn how to salvage and upgrade marginal ones. Which leads us into section 5, the golden window. This urgency creates a fascinating race against time, because we know terminal collapse happens right at 64 hours, and microvascular resistance begins building early. We really only have a critical 12 to 24-hour golden window. This is the exact amount of time required for cellular therapeutics and regenerative agents to incubate, activate, and integrate into the parenchymal tissue. We have to reverse age-related fibrosis and acute kidney injury while the vascular bed is still highly receptive before the machine ruins it. But how do we actually deliver these therapeutics? Well, we essentially have 2 pathways. If we use systemic intravascular delivery, meaning we just inject it into the 800 ml loop, we hit a wall. High vascular resistance in aging organs prevents deep tissue penetration, and the cells might just wash right out. That's why pathway 2, localized parenchymal injection, is the preferred method. By physically injecting directly into the meat of the tissue while the organ is metabolically active in the chamber, we completely saturate the organ matrix, bypassing that vascular resistance entirely. And finally, section 6, the autologous holy grail. If we can master this targeted repair within that golden window, it leads us to the absolute climax of this technology, the ultimate vision for the future of medicine, the autologous ex vivo ecosystem. Here's how it works. Step 1, we surgically explant, or remove, a failing kidney directly from an end-stage renal disease patient, completely bypassing the deceased donor waitlist. Step 2, we hook it up to the ARC device, using that 24-hour golden window to administer targeted cellular therapeutics, clearing the fibrosis and restoring its baseline function. Step 3, we reimplant that newly rejuvenated organ back into the exact same patient. The result? Perfect organ viability, zero need for harsh immunosuppressive drugs, and absolutely zero risk of immune rejection. It is a breathtaking reality to even consider. We are literally on the verge of transforming our own failing organs into our own life-saving cures. So I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. What if, in the very near future, the organ waitlist simply no longer existed? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning what's possible.